excellent opening remark. And I'm really thankful for everyone coming here today. I'm the main organizer of this panel. My name is Sarah Lee. I'm a second-year master's student at the Fletcher School. So this panel, we will talk about developing sustainable transportation infrastructure. And sustainable transportation system, a vital piece of the energy transition puzzle. And most estimates suggest transportation is a fast-growing sector by greenhouse emissions. This panel, we will explore sustainable transportation options and how can be best designed with critical decarbonization to address the energy transition. Over to Harry.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning. Welcome. I'm going to be very brief because we have a short time for our discussion. First of all, I would like to thank Dean Gallagher for the opening remarks and the Tufts Energy Conference team for putting this together and inviting me and great panelists here today for the discussion. I think this topic, sustainable transportation infrastructure, is very timely and in the era of climate change. So I'm going to now introduce our panelists. Next to me is Dr. Daniel Cohn. He's a research scientist at MIT Energy Initiative. And Mr. Ishan Khokar, he's the program officer of the Broadband Group, and he's also an infrastructure specialist. Mr. Mark Chase, he's the founder and principal at Neighborways Design. He's also a lecturer at Urban and Environmental Planning Department at Tufts University. And finally, we have Mr. Daniel Vise. He's a senior associate at Ceres, and he's specializing climate energy and transportation policy. So I just want to share that yesterday I read the news. Actually, the IEA released the data that right now 1 in 7 new cars sold in the world is EV. So this is a very encouraging news. I'm thinking about like 5 years ago, that ratio probably is 1 to 70. But EV is just part of the solution, right, for the sustainable transportation infrastructure. And so my first question, which is related to the theme of our discussion today, is that what are some successful examples of sustainable transportation infrastructure that have effectively reduced emissions or adapted to the climate change? And how can these examples be scaled up to have a greater impact on reducing emissions, not only in developed countries, but also developed countries? And I would like to call Mr. Mark Chase to start this first.
Thank you, Henry. So it's great to see you all here. I had a cold, which I am completely over, but my voice is not totally back. So if I scratch, I tested negative, and so thank you for. It's great to be here, and it's great to see so many people here. I wasn't sure, if we would have most people online, but it's great to be here live with you all. My background is really in helping cities, universities, developers do more sustainable programs for their people, so to speak. I was involved with Zipcar in its early days. My sister was a co-founder of Zipcar. And I feel like that's one very good example, which I'll get to in a second, of a program that has allowed a lot of people to not. But as a lecturer in transportation planning at Tufts UEP, I remember somebody from Vancouver named Tim Beasley, who was head of planning there. He said the best transportation mode is actually good design of your urban space, which means that you can actually get places without a car for most of your trips. Doesn't mean that you don't have a car to do trips to the country, but for most of the things you need, you can get to them without a car. And the examples of how that works, and I think innovation fits into it, was that with Zipcar, roughly every car serves between 20 and 100 people. And a third of those people will sell a car. 2/3 of them maybe never had a car, or it's their second car, but a third of the people who use Zipcar otherwise would have owned a car if it wasn't for the service. And so in a place like Cambridge, where the company was founded, or in cities with excellent land use, it allowed people to take advantage of that technology that they couldn't have taken advantage of if the land use was not excellent. If you had to take a zip car to get to work, you might as well own your own car, it would be expensive. And the results of that in Cambridge were quite dramatic. Zipcar was founded in 2000. Between 2000 and the last time I looked at the stats, I left Zipcar in 2005, but between 2000 and 2010, the parking permits in Cambridge were reduced dramatically by like 30%. Even as the population grew slightly, a lot of people sold cars because they could rely on Zipcar as a way of getting around when they needed a car. So that's my own very personal example. Right now, I'm a founder and principal at a firm that works with residents and neighborhoods to reimagine their streets. And again, this is a case where when you reimagine your street, if you think of the street in front of your house, could it have a park there? And could it be a place where your kids would feel safe playing? And these are the types of conversations that we have with residents. So when we start out, we say in a movie, no animals were harmed in the making of this movie. With Neighborways, we say no parking is harmed in the making of this neighborway, because people really feel like parking is an important resource, no matter how much parking they have. So if you might live in Manhattan, where your chances of finding parking are slim, or you might live in Teal Square, where it's relatively to Manhattan, very easy to find parking, but the perception is that parking is an issue. And I really feel like parking is the one place where we can actually change policy and do some things that are dramatic. But I'm not going to talk forever. I'd like to stop here and either take questions or
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chase. And I just want to apologize. I forgot to introduce our last panelist, and she's joining us over the Zoom, and she's from India. Her name is Sinigada Verma, and she's a manager of Indian Ministry of Power, E-Mobility Convergence. And sorry about that. And Ms. Verma, do you mind give us some introduction of India's experience on the sustainable transportation infrastructure?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm not sure if I can represent the whole of India's mandate on electric mobility, but I can try to share what we are doing. And as you said, that my organization, Convergence Energy Services, is part of the Power Ministry's, it's housed within the Power Ministry. In fact, in the next panel, you have the former CMD of NTPC, which is sort of our investor company. And so I just wanted to share that we have been designated to aggregate demand for electric vehicles across two-wheelers, scooters, cars, buses, and to set up electric charging infrastructure. I'll be happy to share more about our business models, how far we have come in the journey, and yes, any any questions that come from the policy perspective, from the implementation perspective, mostly. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we had Mr. Chase shared with us about Zipcar. Actually, I personally use Zipcar a lot, and also Ms. Verma sharing Indian experience. I would want to ask Mr. Daniel Vise, and because he's working for on the corporation side, and what about it? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, thanks for having me. Really happy to be here. My work at Ceres involves, working with companies with large on-road fleets and helping them really make those fleets more sustainable. So coming from that angle, a specific project that I would like to highlight would be, it's a heavy-duty charging project out in California near the port of Long Beach and the port of Oakland. And so it's led by a group called For Mobility. They're a charging solutions provider, but they've been really successful in raising funding for these charging sites for these medium and heavy duty trucks that make these runs from the ports to distribution centers and back each day. And I think this is a really interesting case study because they've been able to raise funding from several different companies to utilize these charging sites. They partnered with Amazon. They partnered with CBRE, which is a big real estate company. They partnered with Edison Electric. And I think it's a really great case study to see the collaboration and partnerships between companies that are going to be necessary to really drive forward fleet electrification. And then also on the equity side, it's oftentimes underserved communities and marginalized communities that live near these ports and live along these freight routes. So being able to electrify these medium and heavy duty vehicles is going to be really crucial moving forward.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning about the equity issue here. And I think one of the concerns of the energy transition in transportation is how can we reduce this equity issue, which is a historical issue. And so that comes to my next question, which actually last month, EU has implemented this policy, which to ban the ICE vehicle sales by 2035. And I would want to hear our panelists your opinions on this. And do you think this is viable, or what's the negative consequences or the benefits of this policy?
Well, I have concerns about this policy from a number of aspects. One is the risk of near complete dependence of road transportation on the electrical grid. This is something totally new and will provide energy for transportation. And the grid is not going to be the existing grid, which we're familiar with. It's going to be a grid that has a lot of new stresses, weather, the issues connected with the intermittent nature of wind and solar, and also the way the various sources of electricity new are going to be connected to the grid. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. And I think we have to be careful about an over-dependence on the grid. So I don't think it's prudent to stop the production of fossil fuel powered vehicles. I think that could be carried along at the same time with an emphasis on making these vehicles cleaner and more efficient. And another aspect of the dependence on electricity is whether the charging infrastructure for near complete use of electricity is going to be able to serve everyone. That's not proven. I mean, now it does, because there's only a small number of users. And I think this might have an adverse effect on equity, because people in low-income areas typically don't live in single-family homes with a lot of room or capability of doing their own charging. Oftentimes they were big apartment buildings in crowded cities. Are there going to be enough charging stations for people in vulnerable communities? That has to be established. And it may well be that their access to charging is going to be substantially limited relative to the access that wealthier people have. I'm sure that they're properly served. And also these people have less money to spend on transportation. So if it turns out that electric vehicle transportation, particularly if they want to have the same type of range that they had before in their car, they may, affordability may be an issue for them compared to wealthier people. And Another related issue is air pollution. The people in vulnerable communities are generally more adversely affected by local air pollution, ozone, particulates. And so it's very important to be sure that in highway transport, where we use long haul trucks, that as soon as possible, we get to trucks that emit substantially less local air pollution than diesel trucks, and also trucks that produce less greenhouse gas. And I think the movement away from cars, starting with cars to phase out engines, internal combustion engines, might inevitably move to long haul trucks. And I think electrification is going to be much more difficult in long haul trucks. And what this means is people in disadvantaged communities are going to be adversely affected by diesel trucks, because it's going to be thought that the diesel truck is going to be replaced by the electric truck. Well, that's going to take a long time coming. The diesel truck will remain on the road, and people will be adversely affected by the air pollution from diesels. And long haul trucks are a major source of local air pollution. I think in the area of long haul trucks, quickest way to reduce local air pollution and greenhouse gas is to use cleaner engines, which are possible engines that emit less air pollution, and also use emerging low carbon fuels that are liquid fuels and easy to fuel the trucks with. So while I think it's good to encourage people to electrify cars, I think we should be careful about an overdependence on electrification.
Sure, thanks, Henry. And I think I'll just carry forward from where Daniel left. I think very good points there, because when we talk about sustainable transport infrastructure, and again, looking at both greenfield and brownfield development, it's important to understand the entire value chain of the development, right? We're talking about electrification of an entire continent's mobility. Now that will involve a lot more mining in another part of the world for very critical minerals. So it's also important to kind of make sure that the mining which is conducted of these minerals, whether it's cobalt, it's lithium, it's it's nickel, it has to be done in a very sustainable way. And again, that in itself has a lot of social implications as to where the mining is conducted. Of course, there are mechanisms out there to ensure that there is equity in the mining standards. There is sustainable mining practices involved. There are high technology, tools involved there. But entire the ecosystem of electrifying, entire mobility systems would then have a lot of maybe positive implications overall in the long run, but that remains to be seen. So of course, I think EU has made it possible to, by way of their European Green Deal, by way of having many other regulations in the last couple of years, to show that, yeah, there are gold standards to developing such regulations. And they are indeed realistic. But of course, their implementation and their performance. And I'll take a minute more here, because we talk about, so when we know like the current emission standards globally from transport alone is about 24%, which are energy related greenhouse gas emissions. Now, these emissions would go up to 60% by 2050 if the business as usual continues. Now, this again can of course, warrant that we do need to take urgent, decisive actions. And again, EU is trying to take a pathway into it. Of course, like I said, there needs to be, and they must have ensured that there's a balance of, environment and social sustainability standards in there to then achieve that green goal. But again, I think there's a lot more due diligence which would need to be seen, because when we even talk about EU, it's the Western European side of countries and the Eastern European, their energy dependencies could be different, their capabilities or their fiscal capabilities to import energy and fuels may be different. So of course, it's personally, I welcome this regulation, but I think there is some time before we can look at the performance and the implementation. It's still very early stages.
Yes, please. We have a question.
It's not exactly a question, but I think you're speaking about the grid and the world as it would exist if you incrementally changed it. But that's not what we need to do. Incrementalism is basically digging our own graves. If you established enough renewable energy in any region of the country, except probably New England and the US, and anywhere in India, if you had enough renewable energy so that you could handle the power demand during cloudy or rainy periods, you would have free power for 2/3 of the days of the year during the daylight hours, and there'd be no problem getting electricity to every single car in the country because you'd have excess free power. The only spend you'd have to make is to put up the stations. You had no other costs. That's where we need to go. We're talking like solar, for example, has stopped going down in price. That's not right. It's gone down 80%. It's going to go down another 60% in price by 2030. When you take that additional 60% drop and you add it into the equation cost-wise relative to everything else, the argument to do massive solar, to get coverage for even the cloudy periods in most regions, becomes very viable. And now you've got free power during the day all over the country.
Thank you. I just want to go back to the transportation sector, the policy. Mr. Mark Chase and Daniel Vise, do you have any opinions on that part?
I do, yeah. You mentioned the EU's plan to phase out sales of gasoline-powered cars. We have similar policies here in the U.S., right? The Advanced Clean Cars program out in California does the same thing. Other states who are under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act are able to follow California's lead and implement that law. And I personally think it's a very valuable and important rule to have. I'd approach the narrative of a ban on gasoline-powered cars with a little bit of caution. I think it's better to frame it as, this program, the Advanced Clean Cars program, is a common sense tool that we have at our disposal now, gradually phase out gasoline-powered vehicles. I think that's really important to decarbonize the transportation sector. And then when you layer on other policies, like the recent Inflation Reduction Act and the mineral sourcing and domestic manufacturing requirements in that, I think it has a lot of potential to really unlock zero emission transportation sector in the US, clean domestic manufacturing in the US, and really keep the US at a competitive advantage on the clean energy front.
This is not my field, but it does seem to me, I think your question was, or your scenario was to stop production or to actually ban the use of, and I think it's stop production.
Ban the sales of the ICE EV.
So my assumption is that and this is where, when I was a kid, things were different. Cars, when I was a kid, usually lasted about 100,000 miles and were pretty much useless at that point. Now, IC, internal combustion engines, seem to run 200 to 300,000 miles. And so I don't think we're gonna, I'd be shocked if there was some, nothing short of a buyback of ICs, and that ICs will be around for a long time. So not in production, but in use. And having visited Cuba pre-pandemic, I was shocked to see all these 1950s cars that were built to run probably 100,000 miles still in service. So I think if we were to push electric vehicles, probably people would get very creative about keeping the non-electric vehicles that are highly productive, trucking and other sectors where you need either the range or you, for whatever reason, perhaps an equity reason, you can't afford an electric vehicle. You keep this IC running for decades. So that's a possibility. As a urbanist, I don't feel like electric vehicles are really an on or off for me. It's more about traffic congestion and making our cities beautiful places to be, and places where people can not rush to get out of the city on vacation because they're happy being there, and in which case we reduce the need for transportation, because right now our cities aren't that livable, and probably most of us really relish the opportunity to leave the city. And I feel like that's a transportation problem in a way, that our cities are not so comfortable that we're not comfortable being there for long periods of time. Whole nother thing. So thank you.
No, thank you, thank you. I kind of agree. I think the displacement of the ICE vehicles is kind of issue now, because what I've learned recently, so there's a report from UNDP saying that all of the used ICE vehicles in the developed countries were exported to the developing countries. So so that means, like Mr. Chase just said, kind of prolong the lifetime of those ICE vehicles, and it could like slow down the energy transition in the transportation sector in those developing countries. And with that, I just want to ask a question about project finance. I think maybe there is something that finance can do to speed up the electrification of transport sector. So what are the primary challenges for both MDBs and private investors when financing sustainable transportation infrastructure projects? And what steps are being taken to address this challenge?
Sure, thanks. It's a very complex question. But probably we need to understand that, you know, at a very broad level, the challenges are multi-layered, right? They're technical in relation to projects development. Now, of course, when you talk about sustainable infrastructure, we were just discussing decongestion, which takes us to roads. We're going to talk about rail, we're talking about maritime transport, we're talking about aviation, we're talking about EVs. It's a plethora and it's a box full of, you know, modes of transportation, which we need to decarbonize. So the challenge is very complex. We have to first take that into account. So in terms of the specific challenges which we can say collectively all of these modes of transportation are facing today, and to maybe decarbonize it is like I said, first is the technical project development, right? The greenfield investments which will get in, fresh investments which will be brought in, not only in the MDBs, but also looking at the private sector mobilization part. That brings us to the financial bit. And of course, there is a bit of political or geopolitical buy-in also, which is concurrently needed to make that transition, to go to that next step. So if we look at the current transportation systems, they are not resilient to climate change, right? We see flooding of roads, and then we see how transport systems just, you know, they get stranded, right? we see that there are also cybersecurity related attacks where in 2017, there was a cybersecurity attack on one of the shipping carrier companies, and which saw about 76 ports globally stranded. So of course, there is vulnerability and very poor resilience to resist such attacks, right? To resist the information and the communication technology attacks. The third is, of course, we all experience the pandemic. How the current transportation systems are not very well equipped to manage contingencies or to manage even something as complex or maybe simple as social distancing, right? So we saw how, again, transport systems were one of the first systems to get affected. There were very few cars on the road. There was, the air sector was deeply affected financially. So of course, when we talk about developing new projects or taking the next step to decarbonization, and specifically looking at financing, which could be fresh financing for new projects. It could be financing for reconfiguration or rethinking the existing transportation systems. We need to probably take a step back and take a more coordinated approach, right? We need to get the stakeholders together, the different, not only governments, right? Of course, with MDBs mostly work with low and middle income countries. But we need to make sure that these greenfield investments in the transport sector are bringing the stakeholders together in a way that project design is more strategic. It is more, it is not only strategic, but it is also compliant with the national regulation. So that complexity comes in where we are trying to develop a global standard or a global tool for looking at decarbonization. But countries have their own regulations, which are again mandated or influenced by their NDCs going forward. So again, that bit where very strategic institutional capacity building needs to be brought in with governments, with the ministries, with the regulators, in terms of not only developing more sustainable and suitable policies, but also looking at developing the market buy-in. I mean, when we talk about EVs, we're talking about Teslas to tuk-tuks, like it's like EVs in Bangladesh would mean e-rickshaws, or even India for that matter, right? EVs in the US and Canada and the West would of course mean high-end electric vehicles. Of course, battery remains to be the base case, which needs to be the cost of which needs to go down. Professor Gallagher noted very clearly that the cost of storage needs to further go down. Now, unless this buy-in at the government level, at the industry stakeholder level is brought in, the technical project development would not go forward. So we still are a few miles away from developing that, but I'm quite aware of the programs which various MDBs, including the World Bank, are doing to mitigate that gap, to shorten the time. And lastly, I would say, like, we live in an age where data analytics is big, right? So when we're looking at a specific example of, let's say, developing a BRT system or a mass transit system in a highly complex urban space, we need to look at utilization of, GIS systems, looking at traffic decongestion studies, looking at data from mobile phone networks to understand where the congestion is happening. And when we look at financing of such mass transit systems, whether it's a BRT, whether it's investment in a metro line, these more advanced technology tools, these more advanced research methods are very helpful. So again, in a nutshell, I think there's the problem is multi-layered in terms of being technical, financial, and like Daniel said, inclusive, right? We need to build in that inclusivity where specific economic groups, specific gender groups who are probably suffering the most are also included, and they bear the fruit of this decarbonized market.
Thank you, Ishan. And I would like to hear more from Ms. Verma. Could you share with us of some India's case in the project finance in the transportation sector?
Absolutely. So the primary financing source for electric mobility and for encouraging electric mobility has been through a Government of India subsidy called the FAME program, through which incentives are being offered in terms of demand aggregation, in terms of EV charging setup. And in addition to the FAME subsidy, the state level, also a lot of states are taking the initiative to have their own policies for electric mobility, where they're offering purchase incentives, scrapping incentives, they're providing land parcels, interest subvention schemes, and also helping enhance the HT lines for setting up high fast chargers. So these are some of the policy support, both financial and non-financial, that's being offered by the government ecosystem. And in addition to that, for example, at CSL, we are also registering all our projects for carbon financing. So our EV charging project is being registered with Vera with the intention that that can also help with blending the finance. We're also, of course, being supported by multilateral institutions in terms of creating a market for EVs. So that's sort of been the whole landscape. There's also a lot of active interest from venture capitalists, from from startup OEMs who are coming in with innovative models like, for example, charging on the go. It's the sort of models that are coming up, and people are innovating. And so there's a plethora of opportunities, but as previously we were talking about how there are challenges in terms of resources required, in terms of chargers, the chicken and egg situation of whether there are going to be adequate chargers as we are transitioning to electric mobility or not. So those sort of issues are coming into the picture where the government is having to intervene at this point, and where it doesn't seem to be at a point where it's sustainable for the private sector to run. Like our EV chargers are at under 10% utilization in most outside of the primary Delhi NCR sort of regions. So these are challenges that are coming up in terms of both financing and running the projects. And there are these avenues that we are exploring.
Thank you very much. And now we have less than 10 minutes, and I want to open the questions to the room and also to Zoom. And any questions?
Sure. I have a question. Thank you all for being here. By the way, this has been very insightful. Mr. Khokar, you mentioned when you first started speaking, and this isn't a question specifically for you, anyone's free to answer, but you mentioned supply chains, and I thought that was really interesting because one of the things that I'm really interested in is, and also Mr. Cohn, you also mentioned this idea of like, as we move into EVs, we might be creating further dependency on like the electric grid, and that might create a lot of, I don't know, maybe national security related issues or other reliability issues perhaps. So two-part question. The first part is one specific supply chain that I'm very interested in is the lithium supply chain. And I know that there's a lot of problems associated with the lithium supply chain. Do we think that the future of EVs is lithium dependent? And if so, how do we remedy those supply chain issues? And then second, do you think that there are any dependencies that we need to be watching out for as we transition more to EVs, more to public transportation? What are the things that we should be watching out for, not to not like fall into that trap of being overly dependent on certain aspects like the electricity system?
I'm not a lithium supply chain expert, so I may not be able to take that. So I'll take the second part. I think dependencies, again, it has to be seen regional specific or country specific, right? Because each country's energy mix is different. Each country's configuration to accommodate charging infrastructure for electric vehicles is very different. So at the very basic level, I think when the assessment of the needs and the potential has been done, it's very important to look at what other national regulatory frameworks and the goals to, first of all, even look if they are looking for being dependent on a completely electric driven mobility system, because the amount of investment we're looking at is huge in that aspect, right? Like Mark was saying, it's not easy probably to like just phase out all, you know, there are cars running from the 80s and the 90s. So who is going to subsidize, right? There's another big challenge, and this may not directly relate, but it's kind of connected with your question, is the fossil fuel subsidy reform, right? Today, governments want to incentivize renewable energy. They want to incentivize energy storage. They want to also incentivize and encourage deployment of battery energy storage systems. But a lot of countries are also still offering subsidies to fossil fuels. So with limited country national budgets and very limited capability of national banks to take that risk of putting all of their money into electrifying their mobility system is huge on their balance sheets. So the dependencies again can not, I would say, not only be in terms of relying on a certain source of energy or electric system which possibly is vulnerable to cyber attacks or, you know, climate vulnerabilities, and so that resilience has to be built in. But then, of course, there are the financial bit is very, very critical, and of course there are steps taken to mitigate, to find pathways, you know. But again, we are far from having a certain answer to that.
Could I add to that? First, I think the cost of each of the options for dealing with these problems is so important, just for the reason you said. It's just such a gargantuan investment. So I think there should be more attention paid to the cost effectiveness of various options. I don't think that's really been analyzed in enough detail. Oftentimes you have one group pushing for one technology, another group pushing for a different technology. There needs to be better assessment, both in the public sector and the private sector, of the cost effectiveness of various solutions and their probabilities of success. We can't afford to waste money. Now, with regard to the electrification of the transportation, I think there's a major need to upgrade grids everywhere. Grid in the United States consists of many separate grids, and there's a limited amount of interconnection. If the grid is going to be dependent on in a heavy way for transportation as well as the present uses of electricity, it needs to be able to, first of all, handle the addition of new sources of electricity better. Right now, projects for providing wind and solar energy are typically held up for about 4 years before they can supply their electricity to grids, because the interconnections aren't there. And with regard to charging, I think also there has to be some thought given to backup public charging. What happens if the grid goes down? What's the backup? We're going to have another source of power. It doesn't have to provide as much electricity over time, but when we need the electricity, it's got to be there if the grid isn't available. So backup electricity is needed. And then energy storage is going to be very important, because the present grid, including the lithium-ion batteries, just isn't able to cope with multi-day outages. And they don't happen that frequently, but do we want to have them occurring especially when we're so dependent on electricity for our transportation as well as everything else. So that's why there's a lot of emphasis on energy storage. I'd like to point out that better batteries aren't the only way to solve this problem. In fact, one possible solution is to go back to engines, because engines are an extremely low cost source of converting some sort of energy source to electricity, an engine powered generator. And that's ideal for the infrequent use situations for multi-day outages. So if these engines are very cheap, very rapid response, and use the low carbon fuels, could be hydrogen, could be some other fuel, you would have an energy storage system that would be much cheaper than a battery. So that's something I'm working on. I'm not saying that's the end all be all, but it's an example of how there's a variety of options that have to be looked at. I think the grid and all of the implications of electrification of transportation is the most serious issue facing electric vehicles. It's not the vehicle itself.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. The first part of your question about the supply chain, lithium is going to be around for a while, right? It's the lightest metal, it's the most energy dense metal. It's great for batteries. So it's going to be around for a while. There's different chemistries, battery chemistries. You know, you've got lithium iron phosphate, you've got the nickel, manganese, cobalt. And so, you know, China's been investing in the EV supply chain for the last 30 years. So they've come to really dominate it. But with, you know, the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the EU battery directive, the West is really moving really aggressive to onshore some of that supply chain. And you've already seen it here in the US, right? GM invested $650 million into lithium mine up in Northern Nevada. You know, that's going to be the first domino. There's going to be a lot of more investments like that. So lithium will be a crucial part. I don't see us being, you know, totally dependent on it. I think there are other materials that, you know, I think graphite, there's a looming shortage of graphite for the anodes that is not getting as much attention. But then to your second part of your question, you know, the grid infrastructure in the US absolutely needs to be upgraded. You know, it's aging. But there's a misconception that EVs, you know, will strain the grid, right? EVs actually have the ability to provide some much needed flexibility and resiliency to the grid. EVs, you know, they won't all be plugged in, charging at the same exact time during the highest demand on the grid. You've got things like vehicle to grid technology, you've got smart charging, adjust the time and power level that the EVs charge. And so a lot of utilities, PG&E out in California has released their first vehicle to grid commercial rates. So EVs have the ability to really provide some much needed flexibility and resiliency to the grid.
Great. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Thanks, everyone, and for a very interesting panel. My question is, we're hearing increasingly the phrase social infrastructure, and to an extent, yeah, just in a purely academic sense, that refers to more practices and human social systems rather than physical infrastructure. But I was wondering whether, for people who work full-time on infrastructure, does that phrase make sense? Is social infrastructure really infrastructure? And if it is, what does social infrastructure in the context of transportation look like?
I can maybe talk about it a little bit. So there are two aspects: social infrastructure and social inclusion in infrastructure. They are two different things, right? Social infrastructure could be developing schools, hospitals. That's more social infrastructure. Social inclusion in infrastructure, and again, I do not know which one you are referring to, but social inclusion would mean, let's say, developing a rail network, rail link, which is connecting a remote part of a country, making sure that that part is not marginalized, and then of course economically disadvantaged because of missing roads, or even looking at inclusion of specific genders, looking at developing bus rapid transit systems where you can make adjustments or innovations in the BRT system to accommodate for smoother and more convenient travel for older people. So again, there is that small difference, but indeed I can say that most of the projects in the development space have to ensure or do ensure the social inclusion factor, because that is where the benefits, of course, apart from looking at the climate co-benefits, right? Like apart from looking at how much private capital is being raised as an ultimate benefit, but the end user needs to be benefited. And so to make sure that all the people in the society are equally benefiting and none are left out is very important. So social inclusion, or we can also say inclusion, is very important in most infrastructure development. And actually that is what also makes it sustainable, because sustainable is not only green, it's also resilient, it's also inclusive. So it's a very important aspect of most of the new projects which are being invested in, but also of course you can make configurations and changes to the existing transport systems to accommodate for that.
If we have a minute, yeah.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to share again. I'm not sure about the definition we're exploring here, but I thought of mentioning some of the work we're doing on just transition. Again, from the electric mobility perspective, and that also sort of, this is something that I thought of when Mr. Cohn, you had initiated the discussion. For example, as we're moving from diesel or CNG buses to electric, we're also ensuring in our procurement process that for example, the electric buses, that the seats are adjustable for the driver, so that now we can also include women drivers into our the recruitment process for the states, because until now the height requirements for becoming drivers on the public buses was something that most women, and I mean including me, would not be eligible for. So we're sort of trying to make those changes as we are moving to electric vehicles. We're trying to make them more inclusive for women. We're trying to make them more inclusive for people on wheelchairs. That sort of support system is there in the entry into the buses. So those are sort of changes we are doing. And you'd also mentioned initially in the discussion about rickshaws. I think they were also mentioned. So I thought I'd bring up how we are exploring tie-ups with microfinance institutions, because a lot of these auto rickshaws are not owned by one person, but they're shared across a couple of people. So we are also trying to tie up with microfinance institutions and trying to incentivize taking loans for electric rickshaws. So those sort of avenues we're exploring in terms of ensuring that this transition is inclusive, and probably more inclusive than the transport system had been till. So that's also, I thought, maybe relevant over here.
I would add one other aspect to this, which is, I think local air pollution is a growing problem throughout the world. And the studies have recently shown not only does it affect physical health, but it actually affects mental health as well. There's correlation between high air pollution areas and mental problems, anxiety and depression. And we have many major cities in the world that have terrible air quality indices. So I think it's very important to put more emphasis on which approaches will have the largest scale impact in reducing local air pollution. And that has to do with the rate at which we think they're going to be developed. So the time at which there's an impact at scale, at large scale, is very important in choosing the options for transportation, all types, light duty vehicles, delivery trucks, long haul trucks. Each one has different challenges. And I think that needs to be much more considered, along with making progress in reducing greenhouse gas.
Yeah, I totally agree. Recently I just read an article which says that they found this causal relationship between local air pollution and crime rate, and which is true. I mean, kind of so policies targeting not only at federal level but also local level, municipal level, very important. I just want to ask, like, do we have any questions on Zoom? If you have questions, please raise your hand and open your mic, and you can speak. Or any questions in the room? Further questions? Yes, please.
So thank you, by the way, for this panel. This has been really interesting. I know that we've talked a lot about like electric vehicles throughout this discussion. I did want to ask a little bit more though about this idea of like the low carbon fuels, which I think Mr. Cohn, you first brought up. You mentioned hydrogen as well. And I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about that, just give some more examples of what low carbon fuels would look like, because I believe it's like Toyota that's been trying to develop like a hydrogen powered car, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, what Toyota is trying to develop a hydrogen powered car using low carbon hydrogen. That is hydrogen that's produced entirely by electricity, by water electrolysis. I guess the first point I'd like to make is engines are a very good way of converting low carbon fuels into clean mechanical power or electricity, because they've improved a lot over time and further improved. Now, with regard to future fuels, hydrogen is one example. I'm particularly interested in liquid fuels because they're much easier to store and transport than hydrogen. Hydrogen is very difficult to store and transport because it's a very low density gas. So there's potential for producing liquid fuels that are near carbon neutral, or even negative carbon. And I'll give you some examples. One way of doing this is to take a wide range of wastes, agricultural waste, forestry waste, municipal solid waste, and convert them into a gas that's called a synthesis gas, from which you can make liquid fuels. The easiest one to make is methanol, which can work in vehicles like ethanol. And from methanol, you can produce a wide variety of other fuels, including ethanol and dimethyl ether, which is a replacement for propane. Now, these liquid fuels be particularly important in long-haul trucks, where the battery weight and size requirements are huge because of the range of the trucks and the total amount of mass that has to be moved. It's going to be very difficult to electrify trucks. It's a completely different ballgame than electrifying a car. So this is an area where low carbon liquid fuels could make a big difference. And one aspect of it that I think is particularly interesting and could make it a negative carbon fuel is if the fuel is produced from waste that would otherwise go into a landfill, you avoid the methane emissions from landfills. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's much more potent than CO2 on a pound for pound basis. Over 20 years, it's over a 20-year period of its residence time in the atmosphere. Methane is 80 times more greenhouse gas or having a greater greenhouse gas impact than CO2. And it's actually one of the gases that's of most concern now. So that can be, the methane from our landfills can be avoided by taking our waste, and instead of throwing it into a landfill, we use it to produce a fuel to fuel our trucks. That's an example. So there's a wide range of options for improving our fuels and improving our engines. At the same time, we electrify. These pathways shouldn't be thought of in opposition. They should be thought of as complementary, working together.
Thank you. Great panel discussion. I mean, we talked about equity issues, alternatives to EVs, all other things. And I just want to say that thank you all. And I think we are continuing the conversation at the tables. And thanks again. Yeah.